Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Streaming Alchemy Show. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to be taking a look at working with remote panels. Now, for a lot of folks, one of the things that they've been struggling with is how to move real world events into the online space. And a big piece of that is how do you move panels, discussion panels, different types of expert opinion panels? How do you move those into the online world? So, on today's show, we're going to take and focus in on a few different aspects of doing that in a normal production workflow. So, probably if you think about it, the first thing that you consider is that you'll be working with folks in what is effectively a virtual conference. And since everybody in this is going to be remote, you're going to have to figure out how to create a very similar experience that audience is looking for when they would go to a live conference event. So that always will start with a host. And I think in a virtual conference where you're going to have remote guests, a host, somebody who manages the discussion that will take place is critical. You're also, of course, going to be dealing with multiple remote people at these events. And the trick is making that feel like this, something that seems cohesive, where there's interaction, not just between a host and individual panelists, but between the panelists themselves. And I think that's one of the key things we're going to keep emphasizing in this. How do you maintain the dialogue, the banter, the interactions with an audience, between the panelists, and with panelists and a host? So let's dive in a little deeper. The first place all this starts is getting the technology right. And if you don't do that up front, nothing else is really going to work for you sort of downstream from this. So I always start, and I've said this multiple times, no matter that you're dealing with video here, audio is primary. It's the main key to having something that's watchable. And we can all recognize that having better audio gear is going to make that happen. But the thing to keep in mind is it's not just having better audio coming in to your production studio. It's also having better audio for these remote experts, this panel, because you want that level of engagement. And if they're struggling to hear one another, hear the host, hear things that may be, coming in from callers in the audience, any of that will break the flow that you really are looking to achieve with having a remote panel together. So once you sort of take and set audio as your priority, the next thing is to use the best webcam that you have available. But again, only use it for video. Webcams are horrible mics. And so you really want to avoid using that webcam mic. Anything you can do would be better than that, basically. So that's the other thing. There are lots of webcams that are out there, though I totally appreciate today. The best webcam is going to be one you already have, because if you've looked online to buy one, uh, it is not a pretty sight out there. I mean, 720p webcams are going for $200. So clearly, it's not the time to buy something, but use the best you have. And one of the things to consider is potentially using somebody's iPhone as a webcam if you need something that's a quality webcam. That can work with NDI and virtual cameras into a lot of remote guest software. And that could provide a very clean, stable, rich signal on the video front. But again, that's something we can talk about in a little bit. The other thing is consistent lighting. A lot of these are sort of basics, and we've touched on them in different streaming alchemy shows in the past. But so this is something to think about here as well. You're going to need to have some sort of consistent light on the guest for the duration of their live appearance. And this can be natural light, it can be sort of light that's in the environment, where you have lamps or other stuff, but whatever it is, you need to have that, set up consistently. The other thing, and I can't emphasize this enough, is everything should be wired. Uh, always talk about wiring the internet, and that's critical because that's going to make a huge difference in the type of bandwidth you have available to you. But the other thing is avoid using Bluetooth. Bluetooth audio is very, very fickle. Uh, Apple seems to get it the best, but if there's any way to avoid using wireless gear for all of the connections, your cameras, your mics, and your internet, I would highly, highly recommend doing that. And one of the things potentially to consider is actually building, what I'd call a fly pack, a package with all of the gear in it that you could ship out to participants and then get back after an event. So, I mean, that would be, if you're thinking about it, obviously the webcam. And as I mentioned, it would be, if this were a normal uh, environment now, that would be something where you could just buy a set of good quality ones at very reasonable prices. Uh, it can also be a USB headset. Uh, some people really like having the headset. Others feel very uncomfortable with that sitting in front of their face. So there are also options to just have a USB mic, that in addition to having, just sort of the regular cups on for a headset, to also have a desktop style microphone where somebody could just talk into it that way. But again, avoiding using sort of the webcam built-in mics on computers. The other thing potentially is to do something where you ship out a light to people. These lights are very small. This is like a $40 LED light that can provide a consistent source of light if you set it up, with the guest, that can help fill in a lot of the shadows and compensate for whatever the lighting is in their environment. And the other thing to consider is shipping out a USB Ethernet dongle, something that could be plugged in and potentially do that along with a long USB cable. So a fly pack like this would really cover most of the things that guests would need. So one of the other things that I put in this, just if you notice in the slide, is that this Ethernet connector also has USB ports, because you may find that you ship out a bunch of gear, but there's only one open port on the back of somebody's, you know, laptop or desktop. And so giving something where you can do it all in one could definitely be good. And the other thing, if you're going this route, you may want to get something like a desktop tripod, something where if you wanted to clip the light on, you wanted to put the camera up higher, because ideally you'd like to have the camera as close to eye level for most guests as possible. That would be ideal. But everything that we're looking at in this fly pack is something that's probably in a normal environment about $250. So it is something that is practical to do based on the budgets of the production and the event you're putting together. So once you have all the gear and you're focused, on sound over video and everything else we talked about, the next thing is to test. And I can't emphasize the testing component of this enough. So you need to connect with every one of your remote panelists, everybody that's going to be coming in remotely that you're planning on, days before the event. You need to allow, and that's not the day before the event. This is days before the event. Make sure that you have enough time to address any issues, that if you need to get gear to them for something specific to their environment, that you still have time for that. So this is something that you definitely want to be focused on. When you connect to this guest, the first thing I would normally do is a speed test on the guest system. Speed tests are not an absolute indicator of internet bandwidth, but they give you a general sense of what is going to be available there. You can look at some things around their latency, what they call the ping. You'll normally see that. How quickly does that come back? That will tell you a lot about how clean their route is out to the internet. And you get to see get some sense of their overall bandwidth, both up and down, because both are important when you're dealing with remote guests, because you're not just taking their video, and you're also sending them video back. And that's important, again, because we talked about the engagement factor, getting that these remote guests to interact. Getting a clean video signal back to them is really important for that. It makes them feel a part of what's going on. Uh, the next thing really when you do this test setup is make sure that where they're physically positioned will work for the event. You know, we've talked about the windows behind people and all those things play come into play here. But you also may be looking at, can I reach a physically wired internet connection from this location to whatever router or switch they may have in their location? So this could be a consideration, and it could also be things around noise and acoustics. Is the room too live? Is it echoey and makes them difficult to understand? So even if all the other sort of normal things may look right, you may have to work around some other environmental issues there. And that's something that you need to, before you dial everything else in, you want to make sure you have them in the position they're going to be in when they're participating in the event. So, as you mentioned, the first thing is to work on getting the best audio possible. And that involves both that they sound good, but also that they can hear you clearly, because that's critical. The other piece, and this is something that isn't as obvious when we think about testing, have another caller, another remote guest connected. It doesn't have to, it can be somebody in your own production crew, but you want to make sure that the guest talking to each other works well, that both can hear each other, that the audio routing sounds correct, and that when you talk with them, everybody seems to hear you at roughly, the same level, same time. So this would be something that you should consider if you're going to be doing stuff focused specifically around panels that you expect to have interact. So the next thing we talked about is working on getting quality video. And that really starts before you do anything else. It starts with lighting. Get good lighting in place. Uh, and then once you have that, that gives you the maximum signal that's coming in, then focus really on higher frame rates over higher resolutions. And, again, this is probably something we've mentioned in the past, but people are much more visually tuned in to staggered motion than lower res imagery. So if the motion is smooth and the sound is good, people will be comfortable watching that as video. So, as you start to dial this in, that would really be the next step I'd focus on. And then this is again something else, because if you're in an event, this is very different. You need to have those panelists there. It's critical to, potentially what you've promoted for the event and to the overall success of, that panel discussion. So you really need to have a plan B that you test with each of these guests as well. So if you're thinking about what is a plan B, uh, the first place to start is considering a direct connection from their mobile phones. So can come on some days, people's computer will just die. They don't have, any way to connect. You can have something where internet dies and they need to go onto cellular. So being able to test a connecting to a guest via their mobile phone or other mobile, connected mobile device would be great. Uh, so the first thing though is they need to have a headset available. So that could be, if they have a regular headset, it could be just an adapter, something that goes Lightning or USB-C or something to traditional USB to bring in a headset they may already be planning to use. The other thing though is they'll need to have some way of propping the phone up. You want to make sure that whatever they're doing is not that handheld, give everybody seasickness kind of video shoot coming back, because that can be very disturbing for people. So this is something where if you have, something you can send them for this, that would be great. But it could be a stack of books with a bottle on the back that you stick it on there and put a piece of tape along the bottom to hold it. Some plan that makes that work. But you don't want to be doing this, at the last minute, because that could be challenging logistically. The other thing, of course, is to consider using a consumer-focused conferencing solution. Uh, that can be great if the service that you were planning to use for some reason is down. But that really is limited to just that use case, which isn't the main one. Anything around internet or around computer issues, this will do nothing for. So it really isn't a great plan A. It shouldn't be your first step in your plan B. Uh, the next thing is to consider them just bringing them in via phone. So if you can't get it to work the way you would expect, can I just take a phone call from them? And that would mean you have to make sure you have everything dialed in on your end for the audio, and that's both what you get from them and what you return to them. So they would need a mix minus that could go down to them over a phone, and it also means that you have to have a photo ready that you could use sort of as a visual prop when they're talking and participating. But all of these are valid ways to have a backup. But it's really good to know that you have at least one of these that will work for you when you're testing with the user. So that's something, as you sort of go through the steps of what you want to cover, this is something else to keep in mind here. So when we talk about working with audio, let's talk now about the production side. Uh, I would highly, highly recommend working with a mixer. Now, this could either be a physical mixer or it could be something that's software based, where if you bring it in, you can do controls over each individual guest audio levels, uh, the ability to do effects like compressors, especially on those. That's I think really critical to making this type of interaction successful. Uh, and we talked about having inserts of plugins. Those types of things can really make a difference in the quality of the sound. So eh, I tend to like physical things when I'm dealing with live because it gives me a knob that I can grab or a slider that I can move when I need to make an adjustment. But if it's inserts or whether it's plugins, any of those would work. Based on how you want to do it. You also need to be able to support submixes. The world of remote connections is built around mix minus. So every guest is going to potentially need their own mix minus. Some software will do that, uh, but they still need sort of a general mix minus where like none of the guest audio and just studio originated audio. So at a base level, you're going to need to create some mix minuses for your production. So you need to make sure that your gear is equipped to handle that. Uh, so we talked about controlling each guest audio independently, and that's not just the levels, but especially things like equalization and compression, where you may need that to get a level signal from all of the guests, so they sound like they're equally present in the audio mix that you're doing. So definitely, as you think through how you want to set up the audio, that's something else to consider how you're going to configure all of that. Uh, and then the other thing that I would strongly recommend is that you use something called sidechain compression uh, on the host audio. So one of the big challenges when people are remote, where you don't have those visual cues you can use that you'd have when you're, co-located in a physical event, uh, you need some way to take control of a discussion. And sidechain compression is a way that can help you do that. So let's talk a little bit about what it is. Uh, if you have remote guests and you have their audio coming in, and you also have the host and their audio is coming in as they interact, what you'll find is that this audio between the two can easily get muddled, where you don't have the host is talking and then a guest speaks and you can't tell who's talking. Everybody sounds muddled, and it really sounds like an out of control conference call. So what sidechain compression will let you do is it lets you effectively put a device in the middle that can take the audio that you would have coming from the guest. And when that goes out, it can be compressed, leveraging the audio from the host. So that's the sidechain aspect of sidechain compression. So what this will do is that every time the host will speak, it'll lower the audio for the guests coming in. And this gives the host the ability through just voice to control the floor. It lets them talk over a guest, but without it sounding like they're in a shouting contest, where by virtue of them speaking, this will just lower the guest audio and they can again reclaim the floor and do this without having to always sound like they're interrupting somebody. This will be a much more natural way to do that. So, this is something that I would definitely consider as a tool for letting the host maintain control of the panel. So, what do you want to do sort of as a rundown? So, before the event, when you're talking with the guest, you really want to establish a lot of things in advance. So, this would be like, what is it that the guest actually want to cover and talk about? So, this could not just be the things they want to, but also things they don't. So, sometimes uh, guests have different business relationships. So there may be things that they would not feel comfortable talking about or addressing. And you should make sure you understand that as well. So it's not just sort of staying in their wheelhouse, it's staying out of spaces that, are minefields for them and being sympathetic to that. Uh, the next thing is work out the logistics of how you want to conduct the panel in advance because you're not there present, physically there. You want to really set some sort of order to how things will work, where you say, I'm going to ask a question, and then I'm going to call on somebody, and you'll just respond, and then you have a minute or two to do this, and then I'm going to jump in again. So something like this that sort of sets the ground rules for how these interactions will take place. If everybody keeps that in mind and agrees to it, it'll make it go smoother. Now, these don't have to be absolutes, but it's really just a guideline. So it gives everybody parameters that they'll try to work around. But you don't want to do something that's going to kill the dynamic of the panel. That back and forth is really important. You just need the ability to manage that and to reel it back in if it starts to move out of control. Uh, the other thing is know your guests like really, really well. Uh, you want, if you're dealing with people remotely, to be able to direct things to them that are really their strengths, things that they love to talk about. So before you even talk to them, look them up on YouTube. See if they've spoken at anything else. See if they've published any papers. If they're on a website, where, their company is, where you can see the things they do professionally. Those would all be things that would be really useful to you prior to the event to know about these guests. And that will also help you shape questions that you may want to ask them to move a discussion forward during the event. Uh, the other thing is understand how each panel member wants to be introduced. Don't just assume that giving great flowery language is the way everybody would feel comfortable. Different people want to sort of emphasize different aspects of their resume. So capture that in advance as well. And I think that will just make the whole start of the event go much more smoothly. Uh, and the other thing is just verify all the information you'll need for lower thirds before everything is set. So on that, prep call with all of your guests, get all that in, make sure that's all ready because you're going to be doing this, throughout a virtual production, an online production, and you're going to need to have this stuff dialed in and ready before the show. So the other thing is make sure you share with everybody any of the visuals that you will potentially be using during the conference. Even though you're going to be focused on providing a clean return video for the guest, having giving them the option to see this stuff in advance so they can think of interesting points or interesting elements of it that they could talk about when it comes into play during the event, you now have something that they'll recognize without having to try to read it off the screen and be crouched into the webcam looking at what's on their screen. But they'll also have some thoughts about it. So again, something really good to have prepped in advance for this. So during the event, the dynamic is obviously a little bit different when you're working with these people remotely. So the first thing though is always introduce the topic you're going to be talking about and then introduce the panel. So you can make the choice whether you want to introduce them globally yourself or whether you want to let each person introduce themselves, but that's something you work out with the logistics in advance. But always start with that because again, your audience is remote and the panel's remote. So this good initial level set. And the other thing that when I think about this, I really like to open a panel discussion with a general question that's targeted at everyone. You want at the very beginning, when people are remote, to get them all into the game. So don't do something which is going to take a long time to answer. Do something which can be very, very focused in an answer, but that gives everybody on the panel a chance to make their initial mark and to introduce themselves as a expert to the audience that's going to be watching remotely. Because again, that's something I think will put everybody at ease too. Breaks the ice. I'm not waiting for my turn to talk. Everybody gets to talk quickly. Uh, the other thing is you don't have any visual cues here. So there's no way that you can read out of the corner of your eye that somebody else wants to jump in if you're a panelist. So you as the host need to be that motivator. You need to be the ones who will stop somebody and get somebody else on the panel to jump in and converse with them. These types of things are up to you as the host, or if you have a host and you're producing, you have to make sure that takes place because there aren't real physical ways to do that otherwise. Uh, the other piece, which is really related to this, is talk about pausing often, and that opens up some breathing room for other people to jump in. And I think this is just a different skill set than when you normally present in a live environment, but it's really useful when you're talking inside a remote environment. As the host, you can do that. And as panelists, if you encourage them to speak for 30 seconds and take that breath and sort of build in the tempo that you want inside the discussion, that's going to help. And this is all around latency. I mean, if you're a quarter second to a half a second off, when people stop, they're not the remote guests don't hear them stop at that moment. They hear it in it half a second later. So you don't if they jump back in and keep talking, you'll lose that sort of natural pause. This is something where you need to emphasize that. Take a slightly longer pause, count to three, and then go into the next thing. Create these spaces to make these discussions happen. Uh, the other thing is just do good interview techniques. I mean, this I would tell you if you were doing it live too, but listen to the answers that people are giving and ask follow up questions. Try to draw out as complete an answer as you can, but also create more material for other panel members to pick up with and start to discuss. This is sort of being a good host in any situation. You want to get those conversations happening between the different people that you have engaged in the event. And the other thing is make the panelists feel comfortable and make them look good. I mean, your job is to get the most out of all the people that are on the panel. And making them look good doesn't mean, uh, you know, flattering them. It really is trying to see where they're excelling or where they're struggling and jumping in to help or stepping back to give them space to shine. And that's just a talent you develop as a host, but it's definitely something that would be, relevant here. The other thing, which is something to consider, if panelists are not used to talking to an audience remotely, they may need a reminder to look at the camera. So you don't get that sort of, I'm looking here and I'm not looking there. Because that's very easy to happen for people that don't usually do remote productions. So potentially have a DSK that is a little arrow that sort of points up to the camera. So every now and then you can just sit there and sort of say, look in camera and just pop it up there as a DSK for all the remotes and then take it down. So it doesn't have to be an in your face kind of thing, but just a visual reminder you can use multiple times, or if you see them, you know, eyes drifting down and not focusing on connecting with the audience. The other thing that is critical is you need some sort of IFB control with the remote guest. When they're live, having the ability to nudge them, to tell them to do stuff sort of off channel so the audience isn't hearing that can really be critical, especially if they need to do something, to make their production quality better. Sit back, you're out of frame, or stop tapping the table that's being picked up by your mic. Things like that that can sometimes happen. Having that IFB is going to make a world of difference. So everything else, when you think about running these panels, is you have to place the viewers first. How do you deliver the best engaging panel to the people that are viewing? And these viewers are viewing remotely. So the first thing is you want to encourage engagement. So some of this can be comments and call-ins. But if people do that, you want to make sure that you recognize these audience members by name. If somebody is actually asking a question or making a comment, building in that time to say, you know, Frank Smith from Topeka just mentioned that blah, blah, blah. That's really important. Naming that person, having them be recognized, I think can make a big difference in creating rapport between all these different remote parties. The other thing is you are really the audience ombudsman. You're the person, if you're hosting a live panel, a remote panel, you need to stand in for the audience that would normally be there in a live event, in a live world event. Uh, so if you think the audience would be confused by something or that they need more detail, you're the one who has to come in and ask for them. So try to get more information, clarification, and understand that when you deal with experts in any field, there'll be a lot of shortcuts, things that they would naturally take for granted that people understand as sort of context and predicate to something they may be talking about. And if you don't believe that's the case for the audience, jump in there and say something. Get the audience fully on board. The other thing is I would definitely try to create a specific question and answer time, if that is appropriate for the type of event you're producing. So that can be something where you just do that sort of in intervals, where if you had topics that you may be covering at the end of each topic, you sort of open it up for that and try to encourage that. And again, this latency issue is even more of an issue with your audience. So if you want to do Q&A, it's really critical that you understand your audience is probably 10 to 20 seconds behind you. So in your Q&A, introduce that you're welcoming questions, but have some soliloquy that can take up 30 seconds to give that message a chance to get out to the audience and have them start to respond to that. Again, this is not like somebody sitting across the table from you, and be sympathetic to those latencies that are inherent in the medium with online events. The other thing potentially to do is to create an after event, sort of an after panel, whatever it is, some sort of space for the viewers and the panelists to mingle. One of the big things that happen in these conferences is you network. You get a chance to ask one-on-one questions with experts, but you also get a chance potentially to talk to other people in the audience that, may have business opportunities, may have products that could be interesting, whatever. There's a lot that people get from these live conferences that would not necessarily be available to them with a traditional stream. But by creating a space, whether that's something where you move from a stream to say, we have a Zoom space or, some other type of space available, which could have little breakout rooms so each panelist could talk to groups individually or something where everybody is together in one larger space. That can be really, really useful for encouraging and sort of recreating the networking experience that is often lost with the move online. So, something I would definitely think about, and there are probably some pretty creative ways to do things like that could add a lot of value to the productions you're doing. So, that's really everything that I wanted to cover here. I think there are a lot of opportunities when we move online to think about new ways to do productions. I think the key thing if you remember when people started to be using mobile phones more and more to browse the internet, there was a concept of sort of mobile first. Uh, and I think the same thing could start to apply to conferences that are moving online. You may want to think more and more about creating a online first conference and think about all the elements that you would want to package in that. So it isn't the same thing as streaming a physical conference online, but really producing a conference that from the outset is designed for everybody to that's involved to be remote and to participate in that space somehow. So something to think about as you sort of go through what you want to do if you're going to be working on bringing a conference or a panel discussion online in your business. So thank you for joining us. For next week's show, we're going to be talking about different ways to allow remote experts to deliver demos and presentations. And this, for a lot of people, can be a challenge. There are a lot of different potential tools, but we want to explore a couple of different interesting ways that you might be able to do this and still maintain the quality you'd like in the types of productions you put out. So until next week, everyone, please, stay safe and be well. And I'll see you next Friday. Take care.